Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Can you ever truly escape what your mind already knows? The rain pattered against the windshield as I drove along the winding Connecticut roads. My GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond my headlights. I was exhausted after the 8-hour drive from Pittsburgh, my eyes heavy with fatigue. The conference didn't start until tomorrow afternoon, but I decided to arrive early to settle in and prepare my presentation. When the silhouette of Hotel Autumn finally emerged through the curtain of rain, I felt a mixture of relief and something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The building stood 3 stories tall, an old Victorian structure with dark windows that seemed to watch me as I approached. Despite its quaint charm, there was something unsettling about its sharp angles against the night sky. I parked and grabbed my luggage, hunching against the downpour as I hurried toward the entrance. The lobby was warmly lit but eerily quiet. A grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner, marking time with a hollow, resonant sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. "Hello?" I called out, water dripping from my coat onto the polished wooden floor. After a moment, a door behind the reception desk opened and an elderly woman emerged. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes, pale blue and remarkably clear, studied me with an intensity that made me shift uncomfortably. "Welcome to Hotel Autumn," she said, her voice soft yet somehow filling the entire space. "You must be Dr. Mitchell." I nodded, though I couldn't recall mentioning my title when I made the reservation. "That's right. I have a booking for 5 nights. She smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. "Yes, we've been expecting you. Room 27, 3rd floor. The elevator is just around the corner, but I'm afraid it's not working at the moment. You'll have to take the stairs." As she handed me an actual metal key, not a key card, which struck me as oddly antiquated, our fingers brushed, and I felt a jolt of something cold run through me. She must have noticed my reaction because her smile widened slightly. "The weather," she explained, though I wasn't convinced. "It affects the electricity sometimes. Makes things unpredictable." I thanked her and headed toward the staircase, feeling her gaze follow me across the lobby. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step producing a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. On the 2nd floor landing, I passed a large painting of the hotel from what appeared to be the early 1900s. In the foreground stood a group of people, their faces blurred as if in motion, all looking up at the building with expressions I couldn't quite decipher. My room was at the end of a long corridor on the 3rd floor. The wallpaper featured a pattern of autumn leaves that, in the dim light, seemed to shift and rustle as if caught in a gentle breeze. I inserted the key into the lock, which turned with a heavy click that seemed too loud in the silence. Room 27 was spacious but sparsely furnished, a 4-poster bed, a writing desk by the window, an armchair in the corner, and a door leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. The window overlooked the hotel's garden, though in the darkness I could make out only the vague shapes of trees swaying in the wind. I unpacked quickly, hung my presentation clothes in a small closet, and prepared for bed. The bathroom was clean but dated, with black and white tiles and a clawfoot tub that had seen better days. As I brushed my teeth, I could have sworn I heard a whisper, like someone exhaling directly behind me, but when I turned, there was only the empty bathroom. Just the pipes, I told myself. Old buildings make noises. I climbed into bed and switched off the lamp. The darkness was absolute, the kind you rarely experience in cities. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every creak and groan of the old building kept me on edge. And beneath it all, there was another sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. Tap. 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 I sat up, straining my eyes in the darkness. The sound seemed to be coming from the window, yet when I finally gathered the courage to check, there was nothing there but my own reflection, pale and distorted. Eventually, fatigue won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. That's when the dream began, so vivid that it felt less like a dream and more like stepping into someone else's life. I was driving along an unfamiliar road, the sun setting behind mountains I didn't recognize. The car radio played static interspersed with fragments of a woman's voice reading what sounded like a weather report. I felt calm, content even, until I rounded a sharp bend and saw headlights coming directly toward me. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to die. The other driver was in my lane, speeding, and there was nowhere to go, a guardrail on one side, a sheer drop on the other. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the asphalt, but it was too late. The collision was imminent. I woke with a gasp, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The room was still dark, the digital clock on the nightstand reading 3:17 a.m. My skin was clammy with sweat, and my hands trembled as I reached for the lamp switch. Light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows, but not the lingering terror of the dream. It had felt so real, the grip of the steering wheel, the blinding headlights, the absolute certainty of what was about to happen. I got up and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. As I looked in the mirror, I noticed something odd, a small cut on my forehead that hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. It was tiny, barely noticeable, but definitely fresh. Must have scratched myself in my sleep, I thought, but I couldn't quite convince myself. I returned to bed but left the lamp on. As I lay there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, my eyes were drawn to the window. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see that the rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted to reveal a full moon that cast an eerie glow over the garden below. And there, standing perfectly still among the trees, was a figure looking up at my window. At this distance, I couldn't make out their features, just a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. As I watched, frozen, they raised a hand, as if in greeting or warning. I blinked, and they were gone, leaving me to wonder if they had ever been there at all, or if the lingering effects of the nightmare were playing tricks on my mind. Either way, I knew I wouldn't be getting any more sleep that night. I also knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that the dream meant something I wasn't ready to face. What I didn't know then was that I wasn't the only guest at Hotel Autumn having prophetic dreams. And that by the time I discovered the truth, it would already be too late. Morning arrived with deceptive brightness, as if trying to erase the unease of the night before. Sunlight streamed through the curtains I'd failed to close properly, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I had spent the remaining hours before dawn reading through my presentation notes, desperate to focus on something tangible and rational. As I made my way down to breakfast, the hotel seemed different in daylight, less menacing, more quaint. The dining room was adorned with faded photographs of the surrounding countryside and what appeared to be former guests. I was surprised to see several other people already seated at various tables. Somehow, I had assumed I was one of very few guests. I chose a table by the window, away from the others. A waitress, young, with dark circles under her eyes suggesting she too had experienced a restless night, brought me coffee and a menu. "Sleep well?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was more than a casual inquiry. I hesitated. "Not particularly." "Strange dreams." Something flickered across her face, recognition, perhaps even sympathy. "Room 27, right?" When I nodded, she pressed her lips together. "That room has a reputation." Before I could ask what she meant, she was called away to another table. I watched her go, noticing how her hand trembled slightly as she poured coffee for an elderly couple. As I ate my breakfast, eggs that tasted slightly off despite their perfect appearance, I observed my fellow guests. There was something odd about all of them: a middle-aged businessman who kept checking his pulse, a young woman who flinched every time someone dropped a utensil, the elderly couple who spoke in hushed tones, their expressions grave. I was about to leave when someone took the seat opposite me without asking. It was a man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and intense green eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. "Daniel Lewis," he introduced himself, extending a hand that I reluctantly shook. I couldn't help but overhear. "You mentioned strange dreams?" I studied him, unsure whether to confide in a stranger. But there was something in his earnest expression that compelled me to speak. "Yes," I admitted. "Unnervingly vivid. Almost like a premonition," he finished, leaning forward. "Like you were seeing something that hasn't happened yet, but will?" A chill ran down my spine. "How did you know?" He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Because I've had them too. So has everyone in this room, I'd wager. It's why we're all looking like we've seen ghosts, because in a way, we have. Our own." I wanted to dismiss him as delusional, but the dream from the previous night was still too raw, too real. "What did you dream about?" I asked. Daniel's expression darkened. "I dreamt I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. Pancreatic. Terminal. The dream was so detailed, the doctor's office, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, even the pamphlets on the desk about hospice care." He ran a hand through his hair. "I've made an appointment with my doctor for when I get back home. Just to be sure." "And you think, what? That the hotel caused this dream? That it's some kind of omen?" "I don't know what to think," he admitted. "But I've been coming to this conference for 4 years, stayed in this hotel each time, and I've never experienced anything like it. And from the looks of everyone else here, I'm not alone." The conference. I had almost forgotten. "You're here for the Psychology of Trauma Symposium?" He nodded. "I'm presenting on PTSD in first responders." "You?" "Cognitive processing therapy techniques," I replied automatically, my mind elsewhere. "Have you spoken to anyone else about these dreams?" "The waitress, Ellie. She's worked here for about 2 years. Says it happens sometimes, especially in certain rooms. 27 is apparently one of them." I thought of the small cut on my forehead, which still stung faintly. "Has anyone ever brought something back?" "From the dream, I mean." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" I was about to tell him about the cut when a loud crash interrupted us. The young woman at a nearby table had knocked over her water glass, the liquid spraying across the white tablecloth. But it wasn't the accident that caught my attention, it was her face, drained of all color, her eyes fixed on something outside the window. I followed her gaze, but saw only the garden, peaceful in the morning sun. When I turned back, She was already rushing out of the dining room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. "That's Melissa," Daniel said quietly. "She's been here 3 days. Barely sleeps, according to Ellie." After breakfast, I decided to explore the hotel rather than attend the morning sessions of the conference. My presentation wasn't until tomorrow, and my curiosity about Hotel Autumn had become overwhelming. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with numerous corridors that seemed to bend and twist in illogical ways. Several times I found myself in unfamiliar parts of the hotel, though I was certain I had been walking in a straight line. The decor was consistently dated, not quite antique, but certainly from another era, with faded wallpaper and carpets worn thin in the center. On the second floor, I discovered a small library. Dusty volumes lined the shelves, their spines cracked with age. A large table occupied the center of the room, upon which lay an open ledger. Curious, I approached and saw that it was a guest book, with entries dating back decades. As I flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. Among the usual comments praising the hotel's charm or complaining about noisy pipes were more disturbing entries. The dreams. God help me, the dreams. They showed me things no man should see. If you're reading this, leave. Richard Keller, April 7, 1972. I dreamt of water filling my lungs. 3 weeks later, I nearly drowned. This place knows. Anonymous, September 20, 1988. Room 27 showed me my death. I changed my flight. I survived. But it follows me still. Eleanor Wright, May 15, 2001. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. So many people over so many years, all experiencing the same phenomenon. This wasn't mass hysteria or suggestion, it was something else entirely. I was so engrossed that I didn't hear anyone approach until a voice spoke directly behind me. "Finding anything interesting, Dr. Mitchell?" I spun around to find the elderly receptionist from the previous night standing unnervingly close. In daylight, she looked even older, her skin papery and translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. "I was just browsing," I said, trying to sound casual as I closed the ledger. "You have quite a collection here." "Indeed," she replied, her pale eyes never leaving my face. Those who stay at Hotel Autumn often feel compelled to leave a record of their experiences. A form of therapy, perhaps. As a psychologist, you might find that concept familiar. I hadn't told her my profession. "How did you?" "Your name was on the conference list," she explained, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "Many of our guests are attending, though not all returned to the conference after their first night here." There was something in her tone that made me uneasy, as if she were enjoying a private joke at my expense. "About these dreams people seem to have," I began carefully. "Is there an explanation? Something about the hotel that might cause such vivid nightmares?" She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too perfect for her age. "Nightmares, Dr. Mitchell? Is that what you think they are?" She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me, in your professional opinion, what is the difference between a nightmare and a warning?" Before I could answer, the door to the library opened, and Melissa, the woman from breakfast, entered. She stopped abruptly when she saw us, her eyes darting between me and the receptionist. "Excuse me," she mumbled, turning to leave. "Wait," I called out, but she was already gone, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the room. The receptionist's smile widened. "Poor girl. Her dream was particularly vivid. She moved toward the door herself, pausing with her hand on the knob. "You might want to speak with her, Dr. Mitchell. Room 15. And if you're interested in the dreams, you should visit the garden tonight. After midnight. Some say it's easier to understand when the moon is out." With that cryptic suggestion, she left, the sound of her footsteps fading almost immediately, as if she had vanished the moment she stepped into the hallway. I remained in the library for a while longer, leafing through other books but finding nothing relevant to the hotel's strange history. Eventually, I decided to return to my room to prepare for my presentation, though I doubted I could focus on cognitive therapy techniques with the mystery of Hotel Autumn consuming my thoughts. As I walked down the corridor toward the staircase, I passed a housekeeping cart outside one of the rooms. The door was ajar, and through the gap, I could see a maid changing the sheets. What caught my attention, however, was not the maid herself, but the mattress she was working on, specifically, the dark stain in its center, too large and too brown to be anything but blood. She must have sensed my presence because she looked up suddenly, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she hurriedly pulled a clean sheet over the stained mattress and said something in what sounded like Ukrainian. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," I said. She shook her head vigorously and pointed down the hallway, clearly wanting me to leave. As I backed away, I noticed something else, a small charm bracelet on her wrist, identical to one I had seen in my dream on the wrist of the driver in the oncoming car. The coincidence was too specific to ignore, yet too bizarre to process. I hurried back to my room, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Room 27 seemed colder than before, despite the sunny day outside. As I sat at the desk, trying to focus on my notes, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see the figure from the night before. But there was only the garden, serene and ordinary in the daylight. As evening approached, I found myself dreading the night ahead. The thought of experiencing another dream like the previous one filled me with a primal fear I couldn't rationalize away. Yet beneath that fear was a morbid curiosity. What else might the dreams reveal? And were they truly prophetic, as Daniel in the guest book suggested? I decided to skip dinner and the evening conference session. Instead, I walked into the small town about a mile from the hotel, seeking both exercise and escape from the oppressive atmosphere of Hotel Autumn. The fresh air cleared my head somewhat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I sat alone in a corner booth of a local diner, picking at a sandwich I had no appetite for. When I returned to the hotel, night had fallen completely. The lobby was empty except for a different receptionist, younger, with a bored expression that suggested she was unaware of or uninterested in the hotel's peculiarities. I considered asking her about the dreams, but decided against it. Something told me she wouldn't have the answers I sought. Instead, I headed upstairs, determined to stay awake all night if necessary. I had brought sleeping pills with me. I occasionally suffered from insomnia during conferences, but the thought of being chemically forced into sleep while at Hotel Autumn filled me with dread. As I passed room 15, I remembered the receptionist's suggestion to speak with Melissa. I hesitated, then knocked softly. There was no answer, but I could hear movement inside, the rustle of papers, the creak of a chair. "Melissa?" I called quietly. "It's Dr. Mitchell from breakfast. I think we should talk. About the dreams." The movement inside stopped abruptly. After a long pause, footsteps approached the door, but it remained closed. "Go away," came her voice, hoarse as if from crying or lack of sleep. "There's nothing to talk about." "I think there is," I persisted. I had one too. And I saw what you were looking at during breakfast, or rather, who? The figure in the garden. I saw them last night. Another pause, then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened a crack, revealing one bloodshot eye and a slice of a pale face. What did you dream about? She asked. A car accident. I was driving, and someone crossed into my lane. It felt inevitable. She studied me for a moment, then opened the door wider. Her room was identical to mine in layout, but chaotic in a way that suggested several days of distress. Clothes were strewn across the bed, papers covered the desk, and the wastebasket overflowed with crumpled tissues. I dreamed about my sister, she said, motioning for me to sit in the desk chair while she perched on the edge of the bed. She was drowning. I was there, watching, but I couldn't move to save her. I called her as soon as I woke up, and she was fine. Said I was being silly. Her voice broke. But this morning, in the garden, I saw her. Just standing there, dripping wet, looking up at me. And when I blinked, it wasn't her anymore, it was me. A chill ran through me. Have you had any other dreams since you've been here? She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if cold. Every night. Always different, but always ending the same way, with death. Mine, my sister's, strangers. And always so specific, so detailed. And the figure in the garden, you've seen it before? After every dream. Standing in the same spot, looking up at my window. I thought I was hallucinating at first, from lack of sleep. But then I heard other guests talking about it too. I told her about Daniel and the guest book, about the receptionist's suggestion to visit the garden at midnight. Melissa listened, her expression shifting from fear to a sort of resigned curiosity. Do you think we should go? She asked finally. To the garden, I mean. Part of me wanted to say no, to return to my room and barricade the door until morning. But a stronger part, the part that had driven me to study psychology, to understand the human mind in all its complexity, needed answers. Yes, I said. I think we should. We agreed to meet in the lobby at 11:45 p.m. As I left her room, she caught my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Be careful tonight, she warned. Sometimes the dreams come even when you're awake. I returned to my room with her words echoing in my mind. The hours until midnight stretched endlessly before me, each minute marked by the increasingly loud ticking of the clock on the nightstand. To pass the time, I tried calling my wife, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking her to call me back, careful not to mention the dreams or my growing unease. There was no point in worrying her when I had no concrete explanation for what was happening. As 11:45 approached, I prepared to meet Melissa. But as I reached for the door handle, the lights in my room flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness so absolute it felt physical, like a weight pressing against my skin. And in that darkness, I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping against the window glass. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I knew it wasn't just the wind or my imagination. Someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. Against every instinct, I moved toward the sound, my hands outstretched in the darkness. When my fingers touched the cold glass of the window, the tapping stopped. I fumbled for the curtains and pulled them open, half expecting to see the figure from the night before. Instead, I saw only my own reflection, distorted by the darkness within and the moonlight without. But as I stared, My reflection began to change, the features shifting subtly until I was looking at a face that was mine but somehow older, more haggard, with a large gash across the forehead, far more significant than the small cut I had discovered that morning. I stumbled backward, away from the window and whatever apparition it was showing me. My back hit the desk, sending my laptop crashing to the floor. In the same instant, the lights flickered back on, revealing an empty, ordinary hotel room. The window showed only the night sky and the garden below, where a solitary figure waited, Melissa, looking up expectantly. My heart still pounding, I grabbed my room key and hurried downstairs to meet her, trying to convince myself that what I had seen was just a trick of the light, a manifestation of my exhausted mind. But deep down, I knew better. Hotel Autumn was showing me something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Melissa was waiting in the lobby, a black cardigan pulled tight around her thin frame despite the warmth of the evening. Her eyes darted nervously around the empty space, settling on me with visible relief as I approached. "I thought you might not come," she whispered, though there was no one else present to overhear us. "I almost didn't," I admitted, briefly considering whether to tell her about what I had seen in the window. I decided against it. She was frightened enough already. We made our way through a side door that led directly into the garden. The night air was unusually still, without even the slightest breeze to rustle the leaves of the trees that surrounded the small courtyard. The full moon cast everything in a pale, almost theatrical light, creating shadows that seemed deeper and more substantial than they should have been. The garden itself was well maintained but oddly designed, with winding paths that led to nowhere and benches positioned to face blank walls rather than views. At its center stood a stone fountain that no longer ran, its basin dry and cracked with age. Stone figures decorated its rim, not the typical cherubs or nymphs, but twisted, elongated human forms with faces contorting in expressions that might have been ecstasy or agony. "It's nearly midnight," Melissa said, checking her watch. "What exactly are we supposed to do?" Before I could respond, a voice came from behind us. "You wait." We both spun around to find Daniel standing there, his face grave in the moonlight. He had not been there a moment before, I was certain of it. "How did you," Melissa began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "I've been here every night since I arrived," he explained. Trying to understand. "It always happens the same way. At midnight, the dreams, they bleed through, somehow, into this space." I felt a prickle of apprehension. "What do you mean, bleed through?" Instead of answering, Daniel pointed to the fountain. "Watch." As if on cue, the moonlight seemed to intensify, focusing like a spotlight on the dry basin. The air above it shimmered, similar to heat rising from asphalt on a hot day. And then, impossibly, water began to fill the basin, not flowing from the fountain's spout, but materializing out of nothing, rising steadily until it reached the stone rim. "That's not possible," I whispered, but even as I spoke, I knew we had long since left the realm of the possible behind. The water in the basin began to move, swirling slowly at first, then faster, creating a vortex that reflected not the night sky above, but scenes, flashes of images too quick to fully comprehend. A hospital room. A car on Mountain Road. A swimming pool. A kitchen with a knife left unattended. "They're all here," Daniel said softly. "All the dreams. Everyone who's ever stayed at Hotel Autumn and seen what's coming." As we watched, transfixed, the images in the water began to stabilize, focusing on one scene, a young woman, her back to us, standing at the edge of a lake. Her posture was rigid, unnatural. She raised her arms slowly, as if preparing to dive. Beside me, Melissa let out a choked sob. "That's my sister," she whispered. "That's exactly how I saw her in my dream." The figure in the vision turned slightly, and even from this angle, the resemblance to Melissa was striking, the same delicate profile, the same slope of the shoulders. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were open but unseeing, fixed on some middle distance. "She looks like she's sleepwalking," I observed, trying to maintain clinical detachment despite the impossibility of what we were witnessing. Daniel nodded grimly. "That's how it works. The dreams don't just show the future, they create it. The hotel plants the suggestion, and the dreamer carries it out, usually without even knowing why." The scene in the water shifted again, now showing my own dream, the mountain road, the approaching headlights, the inevitable collision. But this time, I could see the driver of the other car clearly. It was me, or rather, another version of me, with the same vacant expression as Melissa's sister. "No," I said, backing away from the fountain. "That's not. I would never deliberately cause an accident." "Not deliberately," Daniel agreed. "But under the influence of what this place puts in your mind, who knows what any of us is capable of?" The water in the fountain began to churn more violently, the images fragmenting and recombining in a dizzying kaleidoscope of potential disasters. And rising from the center of the vortex, a figure began to take shape, not solid, but formed of water and moonlight, its features indistinct except for its eyes, which burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce directly into my mind. "You see now," a voice echoed, though I couldn't tell if it was speaking aloud or directly into my thoughts. "You understand the gift we offer." "Gift?" Melissa cried, her voice edged with hysteria. "You call this a gift?" "Knowledge. Foresight. The chance to change what comes." "But can it be changed?" I asked, stepping forward despite my fear. "If these dreams truly show the future, isn't it fixed? Predetermined?" The figure's head tilted, as if considering my question. "Some futures are fluid. Some are carved in stone. The difference lies in the strength of the dreamer." "That's no answer at all," Daniel snapped. "Either we can change these outcomes or we can't." "Which is it?" "Both. Neither. The question itself is flawed." The figure began to lose cohesion, the water that formed its shape falling back into the basin in droplets that resembled tears. As it dissolved, its final words echoed around us, "Choose wisely. The dreams are doors. What lies beyond them is up to you." And then it was gone, the fountain once again dry and cracked, as if what we had witnessed had never occurred at all. The three of us stood in stunned silence, each processing what we had seen in our own way. Finally, Melissa spoke, her voice small but determined. "I'm going home. Tomorrow. I'm going to find my sister and make sure she stays away from any lakes or rivers. I don't care if the hotel is playing mind games or if these really are prophecies. I'm not going to let it happen." Daniel nodded slowly. "I've decided to do the same. Cancel my presentation, get the medical tests done immediately. If there's even a chance." They both looked at me expectantly. I hesitated, torn between rationality and what I had just experienced. "I need to think," I said finally. "This defies everything I understand about psychology, about reality itself. I can't just accept it without." "Without what?" Daniel asked sharply. "Without proof? What more proof do you need? You saw yourself, your own fate, reflected in that water." "I saw something," I conceded. "But that doesn't mean it's inevitable." It could be suggestion, mass hallucination, something in the water supply making us all experience similar delusions. Listen to yourself, Melissa interrupted. You're grasping at explanations because you're afraid to accept the truth. This place knows things. It shows us what's coming. And it's up to us whether we heed the warning or not. She was right, of course. I was hiding behind scientific skepticism because the alternative, that Hotel Autumn was somehow connected to forces beyond my understanding, was too frightening to accept. But hadn't I always taught my patients that facing fear was the first step toward overcoming it? All right, I said finally. I'll cancel my presentation too. Drive home tomorrow instead of the day after. Take a different route. Avoid mountain roads altogether. Melissa squeezed my arm, relief evident in her expression. Good. None of us should stay here any longer than necessary. As we prepared to return to the hotel, a movement at the edge of the garden caught my attention. A figure stood partially concealed by the shadows of a large oak tree, the elderly receptionist, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. When she realized I had noticed her, she stepped forward into the moonlight. Made your decisions, have you? She called, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. Chosen your paths? We approached her cautiously, as one might approach a potentially dangerous animal. Up close, her eyes seemed to reflect the moonlight in a way that was distinctly inhuman. What is this place? I demanded. What's happening to us? Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hotel Autumn has stood on this ground for over 200 years, Dr. Mitchell. It has witnessed much, absorbed much. The veil between what is and what will be grows thin here, allowing glimpses through to those receptive enough to see. But why show us these things if we can change them? Daniel asked. What's the point? The receptionist's gaze fixed on him with unnerving intensity. Can you change them, Mr. Lewis? Or do your attempts to avoid one fate simply lead you down another path to the same destination? You're saying it's hopeless, Melissa said, her voice breaking. Then no matter what we do, the outcome will be the same. I'm saying that fate is rarely as straightforward as we would like it to be, the receptionist replied. The hotel shows. It doesn't dictate. What you do with the knowledge is your choice. But choices have consequences, ripples that extend far beyond what you can see. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. Sleep well, all of you. The final night is often the most revealing. With that cryptic statement, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving us alone in the moonlit garden. We stood in silence for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. The night air seemed to have grown colder, and I found myself shivering despite the warmth of the evening. What did she mean by the final night? Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head. I don't know, but I don't intend to find out. I'm packing my things and checking out now, even if it means driving through the night. Is that wise? I questioned. You're exhausted. We all are. Driving while sleep deprived could be dangerous. More dangerous than staying here, he countered. After what we just saw, I couldn't argue with his logic. Whatever was happening at Hotel Autumn, it was clear that none of us would find peace within its walls. I'm leaving too, Melissa decided, already turning toward the hotel. I need to get to my sister as soon as possible. I watched them go, torn between following their example and my own stubborn need to understand. The scientist in me couldn't simply walk away from a phenomenon this inexplicable without at least attempting to make sense of it. I'll stay, I called after them. Just tonight. If I learn anything else, I'll let you know. They both looked back at me with expressions that ranged from concern to outright disbelief. That's insane, Daniel stated flatly. After everything we've seen. Because of everything we've seen, I corrected him. Look, we're all making decisions based on incomplete information. What if there's more to this than we understand? What if leaving is actually the wrong choice? Melissa approached me, her eyes wide with fear and determination. James, please don't do this. Whatever answers you're looking for, they're not worth the risk. I appreciated her concern, but my mind was made up. One more night. I'll be careful, I promise. They could see there was no dissuading me. After exchanging contact information and extracting multiple promises that I would call them the moment I left the hotel, they reluctantly departed to pack their things. Left alone in the garden, I returned to the fountain, studying its dry basin and the strange figures that adorned it. In the moonlight, their contorted expressions seemed even more disturbing, as if they were silently screaming warnings I couldn't quite comprehend. I ran my fingers along the cracked stone, wondering what force could possibly animate water that didn't exist, create visions of futures that hadn't yet happened. Was it mass suggestion, as I had proposed earlier? Some kind of hallucinogen in the hotel's air or water supply? Or was it something more, something that defied conventional science altogether? As a psychologist, I had encountered many patients who believed they could foresee the future. In clinical terms, these were delusions, often symptomatic of various disorders. But what I had witnessed tonight couldn't be so easily dismissed. The shared nature of the experience, the specificity of the visions, the physical manifestation of the water in the fountain, all suggested something beyond psychological explanation. I was still pondering these questions when I heard footsteps behind me. Expecting to see the receptionist again, I turned, prepared to demand more concrete answers. Instead, I found the Ukrainian maid from earlier, her expression wary as she approached. In the moonlight, I could see that she was older than I had initially thought, with deep lines etched around her eyes and mouth. "You should not be here," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. "Not at night. Not alone. Do you know what's happening?" I asked, sensing she might have insights the receptionist had withheld. "These dreams, the visions in the fountain, are they real?" She glanced nervously toward the hotel, as if afraid of being overheard. "I work here 6 years. I see many guests come, have dreams, leave afraid. Some listen to warnings. Some do not. And those who don't listen, what happens to them?" Her eyes met mine, filled with a sadness that transcended language barriers. "What hotel shows, it happens. Always. But how it happens, when it happens, this can change, sometimes. So there is hope?" I pressed. "The future isn't fixed." She twisted the charm bracelet on her wrist, the same bracelet I had seen in my dream. "Hope is a dangerous thing, Dr. Mitchell. Makes people take risks, ignore warnings." She held up her wrist, displaying the bracelet deliberately. "You see this in your dream, yes? Is warning. Connection." I stared at the bracelet, its significance suddenly clear. "You're the driver. In my dream, you're the one who crosses into my lane." She nodded solemnly. "Or you cross into mine. Dream doesn't show everything, only end. But why? Why would either of us? Hotel knows. Hotel doesn't tell. Only shows. With that cryptic statement, she turned to leave, but I caught her arm gently. Wait. Please. If you know something that could help me understand. She hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Room 27 has most powerful dreams. Most clear visions. Is why they put you there? They? I repeated. You mean the hotel staff? The receptionist? Hotel chooses, she insisted. Hotel knows what each person needs to see. A chill ran through me at her words. The implication that the hotel itself was somehow sentient, making deliberate choices about its guests, was disturbing on a level I couldn't quite articulate. How can a building know anything? I asked, though even as I spoke, I knew I was applying rational logic to a situation that defied rationality. The maid gave me a pitying look, as if I was a child failing to grasp a simple concept. Not building. What lives in building? What has always been here, long before hotel? She made a subtle gesture with her free hand, something between a cross and a warning sign. Old spirits. Hungry spirits. They feed on fear, on knowing. I wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, but after what I had witnessed at the fountain, I couldn't simply disregard them. And these spirits, they show us our deaths. Is that it? Not always death, she corrected. Sometimes worse. Loss. Pain. Failure. She pulled her arm free from my grasp. You should leave, Dr. Mitchell. Before final dream is strongest, most clear, most convincing. Convincing of what? Of inevitability. With that, she hurried away, disappearing into the hotel before I could ask any more questions. I remained in the garden for a while longer, trying to process everything I had learned. The rational part of my mind continued to search for scientific explanations. Perhaps the hotel was built over natural gas deposits that caused hallucinations, or maybe there was a fungal spore in the old wood that induced shared delusions. But deep down, I knew these explanations were insufficient. Eventually, the chill of the night drove me back inside. The lobby was deserted, even the reception desk was unmanned. I noticed a single key hanging on the board behind the desk, the key to room 27. My room. As if no other guests remained. Had Daniel and Melissa already checked out? It seemed impossible that they could have packed and left in such a short time, yet the hotel felt empty, abandoned. I made my way up the stairs, which creaked beneath my weight with an almost deliberate slowness, as if the building itself was savoring my presence. The corridor on the third floor was dimly lit, the wallpaper's autumn leaf pattern seeming to shift and rustle as I passed. When I reached my door, I hesitated, key in hand. The maid's warning about the final dream echoed in my mind. Perhaps it wasn't too late to follow Daniel and Melissa's example, to pack my things and leave immediately. But where would I go? It was past midnight, and I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The nearest town was miles away, and I doubted I could find accommodation at this hour. No, the sensible thing was to get some rest and leave first thing in the morning. Besides, if I truly wanted to understand what was happening, I needed to experience this final dream she had mentioned. Decision made, I unlocked the door and entered room 27. Everything was exactly as I had left it, my laptop on the desk, my clothes hanging in the closet, my toiletries arranged neatly in the bathroom. Yet something felt different, as if the room had been waiting for me, anticipating my return. I prepared for bed mechanically, going through the motions of my nightly routine while my mind continued to race. I briefly considered taking one of my sleeping pills, then decided against it. If I was going to dream, I wanted to be able to wake myself if necessary. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I tried to make sense of everything that had happened since my arrival at Hotel Autumn. The dreams that felt more like visions. The water that appeared and disappeared in the fountain. The figure formed of moonlight and liquid that spoke of gifts and choices. The maid with her talk of hungry spirits. None of it fit into my understanding of the world, yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own senses. Something extraordinary was happening in this hotel, something that defied explanation but demanded acknowledgement. My thoughts turned to my wife, safe at home, unaware of the strangeness I was experiencing. I had tried calling her again before bed, but once more the call had gone to voicemail. I left another message, careful to sound casual, mentioning that I might come home early but giving no hint of my true reasons. As minutes stretched into hours, exhaustion finally began to overcome anxiety. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts becoming disjointed and dreamlike even before sleep claimed me. The last thing I remember seeing before darkness engulfed me was a shadow moving across the ceiling, not cast by anything in the room, but seemingly autonomous, with purpose in its fluid motion. And then the dream began, the final dream, more vivid and immersive than anything I had experienced before. I was driving along a mountain road, just as in my previous dream, but this time I was acutely aware that I was dreaming. The sensation was similar to lucid dreaming, where the dreamer maintains consciousness within the dream state, able to observe and sometimes influence the dream's progression. The car radio played static interspersed with fragments of a woman's voice, just as before. But now I could make out more of what she was saying: unusual weather patterns, reported sightings, authorities advised staying indoors. The road ahead curved sharply around the mountainside, revealing a breathtaking view of a valley bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, not just because I had dreamed something similar before, but as if I had actually been here, driven this road in reality. As I approached the curve, I saw something that hadn't been present in the previous dream, a small roadside shrine, the kind often found in rural areas to commemorate accident victims. Flowers had been placed before it, fresh ones, their colors vibrant in the fading light. Without consciously deciding to, I pulled over and got out of the car. The air was cool, scented with pine and something else, something metallic, like the smell of an approaching storm. I approached the shrine, drawn by an inexplicable need to see whose memory it honored. A photograph had been placed at its center, a photograph of me. I staggered backward, overwhelmed by a wave of vertigo. This wasn't just a dream showing my future, it was showing the aftermath, the memorial that would be erected after my death. As I stood there, trying to process this impossible sight, I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. I turned to see headlights rounding the curve, heading directly toward where my car was parked partially on the road. In that moment, I understood. It wasn't that another driver would cross into my lane, causing the accident. It was that I would stop here, at this shrine that didn't yet exist, placing my car in a dangerous position on this blind curve. The oncoming car, a small delivery van, swerved to avoid hitting my vehicle, but the maneuver sent it careening toward where I stood. I saw the driver's face through the windshield, eyes wide with panic, the Ukrainian maid, her charm bracelet catching the light as she gripped the steering wheel. I tried to move, to leap out of the van's path, but my limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. All I could do was watch as death hurled toward me at 50 miles per hour. The impact, when it came, was both excruciating and oddly distant, as if happening to someone else. I felt my body being thrown through the air, saw the ground rushing up to meet me, experienced the crushing sensation as I landed. And then, mercifully, darkness. But the dream didn't end. Instead, I found myself standing beside my own broken body, watching as the maid scrambled from her van, phone in hand, frantically dialing for help. I saw her kneel beside me, checking for a pulse she wouldn't find, her face contorted with guilt and horror. And standing just beyond her, observing the scene with detached interest, was the elderly receptionist. She seemed to look directly at me, not at my physical form lying on the ground, but at whatever part of me was now watching the scene unfold. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice clear despite the distance between us. "This is one possible ending. There are others. How can I avoid this?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and echoing in this dream space. "If I don't stop at the shrine." "The shrine doesn't exist yet," she interrupted. "It only appears after. Cause and effect become tangled here." "Then what's the point of showing me this?" I demanded, anger cutting through my fear. "If it's inevitable." "I didn't say it was inevitable. Only that it's one possible ending." She gestured toward the horizon, where the sun continued its descent. "Time isn't as linear as you believe, Dr. Mitchell. Future affects past, affects present, all interconnected. The hotel shows you these connections, these threads of possibility. But how do I change it? How do I avoid this fate?" The receptionist smiled, that same unsettling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some avoid by listening. Some avoid by defying. Some avoid by accepting. That's not an answer." I shouted, but my voice seemed to diminish, growing fainter as the dream began to dissolve around me. The last thing I saw before waking was the maid, still kneeling beside my broken body, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her charm bracelet, a charm bracelet I suddenly remembered giving my wife on our 5th anniversary years ago. I awoke with a gasp, my body drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was dark, but not completely. A faint glow from the bathroom nightlight spilled into the bedroom, casting long shadows across the floor. For several minutes, I simply lay there, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The dream had been so vivid, so detailed, that it felt less like a dream and more like a glimpse into another reality, one that could become mine if I didn't find a way to alter the course of events. But how? The receptionist's cryptic words offered little concrete guidance. Some avoid by listening. Some avoid by defying. Some avoid by accepting. What did that even mean? As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something on the nightstand that hadn't been there when I went to bed, a small silver charm bracelet, identical to the one the maid had worn in my dream. With trembling fingers, I reached for it, half expecting it to disappear at my touch. But it was solid, real, a physical object that couldn't possibly be here, yet was. Attached to it was a small note, written in an elegant, old-fashioned script, "Choose wisely." I sat up, fully awake now, clutching the bracelet as if it were both a lifeline and a curse. Was this a message? A warning? A test? The hotel was showing me something beyond the dream itself, a connection I had missed, a detail that could change everything. The bracelet wasn't just a random accessory, it was a link between me and the maid, between past and future. And suddenly, with a clarity that was almost blinding, I understood what I needed to do. Dawn was still hours away when I got dressed, movements deliberate despite the urgency I felt. The charm bracelet weighed heavy in my pocket, its presence a constant reminder of what I had seen, what might come to pass if I didn't act. The hotel corridors were silent as I made my way downstairs, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. I half expected to encounter the elderly receptionist lurking in some shadowy corner, but the building seemed deserted, holding its breath as I passed through. In the lobby, the grandfather clock showed 3:17 a.m., the exact time I had awakened from my first dream 2 nights ago. I tried the front door, finding it unlocked. Outside, the air was cool and damp, a light fog having settled over the grounds, shrouding the garden in a ghostly veil. I needed to find the maid, to warn her, to understand her connection to all this. If the charm bracelet was indeed the same one I had given my wife years ago, how had it come into her possession? And why had the hotel chosen to highlight this particular connection in my dreams? The staff quarters were likely behind the hotel, perhaps in a separate building. I skirted the main structure, making my way around to what appeared to be a service area. A small cottage stood apart from the hotel, lights glowing dimly from within. As I approached, I could hear faint music, a melancholy folk song in what I assumed was Ukrainian. I hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What exactly was I planning to say? That I had prophetic dreams of her killing me in a car accident? That I'd found a charm bracelet that shouldn't exist in my hotel room? Any of it sounded like the ravings of a lunatic when formed into actual words. Before I could decide on an approach, the door opened, revealing the maid. She didn't seem surprised to see me, as if she had been expecting my visit all along. "Dr. Mitchell," she said softly, "you had final dream." It wasn't a question. I nodded, removing the charm bracelet from my pocket and holding it out to her. This was on my nightstand when I woke up. "In my dream, you were wearing it when?" I trailed off, unable to articulate the scene of my own death. She took the bracelet, running her fingers over the charms with a familiarity that sent a chill through me. "Is mine," she confirmed. "Was gift from previous guest. Man who stayed in room 27, like you. He had dreams too." "What man?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Doctor, like you. Psychologist. He gave me a bracelet morning he'd check out. Said it belonged to his wife, but she no longer needed it." Her eyes met mine, filled with a knowing sadness. "He died 2 weeks later. Car accident on Mountain Road." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "He had the same dream I did?" She nodded. "Hotel shows what could be. Sometimes same vision passes from guest to guest, like, how you say, relay race? Baton passed until someone breaks chain." "And you? What did you dream about?" Her expression darkened. "I dream of driving van, of man standing in road, of accident I cannot prevent. Every night since I start work here. Same dream." I struggled to process this information. If she had been dreaming of the accident as well, from her perspective, then both of us were being shown the same event from different angles. "In my dream, you were wearing this bracelet," I said. "It's significant somehow." "Is connection," she agreed. "Link between past, present, future. Between you and man who was here before. Between choices made and choices still to make. The psychologist who gave you the bracelet, did he try to prevent his accident? He leave hotel early. Change travel plans. Take different roads." She twisted the bracelet around her wrist, the charms catching the dim light. "But fate find him anyway. Different road, different time, same end. So it's hopeless?" I asked, despondency threatening to overwhelm me. "No matter what we do, the outcome is fixed." "Not fixed," she insisted. "But not easy to change. Hotel shows truth, but truth have many faces. Many paths lead to same destination. Then what's the point? Why show us these visions if we can't change them? She led me inside, gesturing for me to sit at a small table while she put on a kettle for tea. The cottage was humble but meticulously kept, with framed photographs of what I assumed were family members back in Ukraine. Among them, I noticed one that seemed out of place, a Polaroid of a young woman standing in front of Hotel Autumn, her expression solemn. Following my gaze, the maid, whose name, I learned, was Katerina, picked up the photograph. My sister, she explained. She worked here before me. Have dreams too. Many dreams. What happened to her? I asked, though I suspected this story would not have a happy ending. She tried to warn guests about a dream. Guests become afraid, leave hotel in middle of night. Drive too fast on wet roads. Katerina's voice cracked slightly. Car go off cliff. Guests die. My sister blamed herself, cannot live with guilt. She didn't need to elaborate further. The implication was clear. Her sister had taken her own life, unable to bear the responsibility of inadvertently causing the very tragedy she had tried to prevent. I'm sorry, I said, the words wholly inadequate for the weight of her loss. Katerina nodded in acknowledgement, then placed a cup of tea before me. The liquid was dark and fragrant, steam rising in delicate spirals. Hotel Autumn take much from many people, she said. But it also gives something. Understanding. Choice. What choice? I asked. Yet the visions come true regardless of what we do. Not how they come true, she interrupted. When? Why? With what meaning? She sat across from me, her own tea untouched. Man who give me bracelet, he run from fate. Try to escape. But you seek understanding. This is different path. I pondered her words as I sipped the tea, which was bitter but oddly comforting. The receptionist said something similar in my dream. Some avoid by listening. Some avoid by defying. Some avoid by accepting. I didn't understand what she meant. Old woman knows hotel better than anyone, Katerina said. She been here, very long time. Longer than should be possible. A thought occurred to me. Is she part of whatever causes these dreams? These visions? Katerina didn't answer directly, but her expression confirmed my suspicion. Hotel needs keeper. Someone to manage what it does. What it shows. And the fountain in the garden? The figure we saw form from water? Manifestation. Way for hotel to communicate directly. Happens only when necessary, when message very important. I tried to organize my thoughts, to make sense of everything I had learned. So if I understand correctly, Hotel Autumn somehow shows its guests visions of potential futures, specifically traumatic or fatal events. These visions can be shared between people connected to the event. And while the events themselves are difficult to prevent entirely, there may be ways to alter their significance. Their timing? Yes, Katerina nodded emphatically. Hotel not cruel. It not want suffering. It want awareness. Understanding. But why? What purpose does it serve? She looked uncomfortable with the question. Some say hotel built on old ground. Sacred ground. Place where veil between worlds thin, where time not work same as other places. She lowered her voice, as if afraid of being overheard. Others say hotel itself alive, in way. Conscious. It feed on emotions, fear, yes, but also acceptance, growth. Neither explanation fit neatly into my worldview, but after everything I had experienced, I couldn't simply dismiss them. Whether Hotel Autumn was built on some kind of paranormal hotspot or was itself a sentient entity, the effect was the same. It showed its guests glimpses of possible futures, often traumatic ones. The previous psychologist, I said, the one who gave you the bracelet. Did he understand what was happening? At end, yes, Katarina replied. He accepted what hotels show him. But too late. Already set events in motion by trying to escape. And that's the key, isn't it? I realized. It's not about preventing the events from happening at all. It's about how we respond to the knowledge. Whether we run from it or face it. She nodded solemnly. Hotels show truth. What you do with truth is choice. We sat in silence for a while, the implications of our conversation settling around us like dust. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the fog. What will you do now, Dr. Mitchell? Katarina finally asked. It was the question I had been turning over in my mind since waking from the final dream. The rational, scientific part of me wanted to dismiss everything as an elaborate hallucination, to check out of Hotel Autumn and never look back. But a deeper part, the part that had chosen to study psychology precisely because I believed in the complexity of human experience, knew I couldn't simply walk away from this. I need to understand more, I said. About the hotel, about these visions, about why some people can change their fates and others can't. Be careful, she warned. Knowledge comes with price. Hotel does not give answers easily. But it does give them, I persisted. The receptionist, the dreams, the fountain, they're all pieces of a puzzle. I just need to put them together correctly. Katarina studied me intently, as if searching for something in my expression. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and stood up. Come, she said. I show you something. She led me to a small bureau in the corner of the room and opened its top drawer. From inside, she removed a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to my sister, she explained. She kept record of dreams, hers and guests. Many years of observations. She handed me the journal with a reverence that suggested it was her most precious possession. Maybe help you understand better. I accepted it gratefully, sensing that this was a significant gesture of trust. Thank you. I'll take care of it. Return before you leave, she instructed. His important record. I promised I would, then asked the question that had been nagging at me since our conversation began. Katarina, in my dream, the final one, you were driving a delivery van. Do you actually drive such a vehicle? She nodded. For hotel supplies. Twice a week I drive to town, bring back food, linens, whatever needed. And the route, does it include a mountain road? One with sharp curves? Yes, she confirmed. Only way from town to hotel. Very dangerous in bad weather or at night. The pieces were falling into place, the dream scenario becoming increasingly plausible. What day do you usually make this drive? Mondays and Thursdays, she said. Today is Thursday. I go after breakfast. A chill ran through me. Today. The accident from my dream could happen today, if I let events unfold as shown. Don't, I said urgently. Don't drive today. Call in sick, ask someone else to do it, anything. Katarina shook her head sadly. If I not drive, someone else do. Maybe they have accident instead. Maybe worse accident, with more people hurt. This is problem with trying to change what hotel shows. Ripples spread, consequences multiply. Then what do we do? I asked, frustration evident in my voice. Just let it happen? Accept that one of us is going to die today? No, she said firmly. We understand. We prepare. We face with open eyes. She reached for the bracelet still lying on the table between us and held it out to me. Take. Is connection between past and future. Between us. Maybe key to breaking cycle. I accepted the bracelet, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic, in my palm. I still don't understand how this connects to everything. You will, she assured me. When time comes. With that cryptic statement, our conversation seemed to reach its natural conclusion. Dawn had fully broken outside, the fog beginning to dissipate as sunlight pierced through. I thanked Katarina for her insights in the journal, promising again to return it before I left Hotel Autumn. As I walked back to the main building, the journal tucked securely under my arm, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. The prospect that the accident from my dream might occur today was terrifying, yet the possibility of understanding it, perhaps even altering its outcome, gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since arriving at the hotel. The lobby was still deserted when I entered, though I could hear movement from the direction of the kitchen, suggesting the day staff had begun to arrive. I made my way upstairs to room 27, passing a housekeeping cart in the hallway, not Katarina's, but another maid's, who nodded politely as I passed. Once inside my room, I settled at the desk and opened Katarina's sister's journal. The entries dated back over 15 years, written in a mixture of Ukrainian and broken English. Early pages contained detailed accounts of her own dreams, recurring nightmares about a fire, about being trapped in a small space, about falling from a great height. Later entries documented dreams reported by guests, along with notes about whether these guests heeded the warnings contained within and what ultimately happened to them. A pattern began to emerge as I read. Guests who panicked and fled the hotel, trying to avoid their fates entirely, often met those fates anyway, sometimes in more tragic circumstances than initially shown. Those who dismissed the dreams as mere nightmares, refusing to acknowledge their significance, similarly found the visions coming true, usually exactly as predicted. But a third category existed, guests who neither ran from nor ignored the dreams, but instead sought to understand them, to integrate their lessons, to face them with what Katarina had called open eyes. These individuals sometimes, not always, but sometimes, managed to alter the outcome, or at least its meaning. One entry in particular caught my attention. April 12, 2005, American professor, room 27, dreamed of drowning. Spent 3 days researching symbolism of water, death, rebirth. Left hotel calmly, wrote letter 1 month later saying he nearly drowned saving child at beach, but remembered dream, remained calm, both survived. Said hotel dream gave him rehearsal for actual event. The concept resonated with my clinical experience. In exposure therapy, patients are gradually exposed to the sources of their fears in a controlled environment, allowing them to develop coping mechanisms for when they encounter these triggers in real life. Was that what Hotel Autumn was doing? Providing a kind of supernatural exposure therapy, a rehearsal for traumatic events? I continued reading, losing track of time as I absorbed account after account of dreams and their aftermaths. Some stories ended in tragedy, others in narrow escapes, still others in profound personal transformations. The common thread wasn't the outcome but the catalyst, Hotel Autumn, showing its guests glimpses of possible futures and leading them to decide what to do with that knowledge. A knock at my door startled me from my reading. I opened it to find Daniel standing there, looking haggard but determined. "You're still here," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I thought you might have left already." "I decided to stay," I replied, inviting him in. "Learn more about what's happening." He entered hesitantly, glancing around the room as if expecting to find something amiss. "Melissa left last night. Couldn't get out of here fast enough." I was about to do the same, but he trailed off, clearly struggling with something. "But what?" I prompted. "I had another dream," he admitted. "Different from the others. Not about my diagnosis, but about after. About what happens if I run from it, if I don't face it head on." He sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "In the dream, I avoided all medical care out of fear, and when they finally found the cancer, it had spread too far. I didn't just die, I suffered. Horribly." I nodded, understanding dawning. "The hotel was showing you an alternative. What happens if you try to escape fate entirely?" "Exactly. And I realized something when I woke up. I've been running from things my whole life. Difficult conversations, emotional challenges, health concerns. I've always found a way to avoid facing them directly." He looked up at me, a new resolve in his eyes. "I'm going to go to that appointment when I get home. But I'm not going to let fear rule me, whether the diagnosis is what I dreamt or not." His words aligned perfectly with what I had been reading in the journal, with what Katarina had tried to explain. "The hotel doesn't just show us potential tragedies," I said slowly, working it out as I spoke. "It shows us paths, different ways of responding to what life throws at us." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "And I think that's the real gift here. Not the foreknowledge itself, but the opportunity to decide who we want to be when faced with the inevitable." We spent the next hour discussing our experiences, sharing insights and theories. I showed him Katarina's sister's journal, not all of it, as much was private, but enough to support our emerging understanding of Hotel Autumn's nature. As our conversation wound down, Daniel glanced at his watch. "I should get going. My flight's this afternoon, and I want to allow plenty of time to reach the airport." "Drive carefully," I said, the words carrying more weight than they would have days earlier. He smiled grimly. "Always. Though I'm taking the interstate, not the scenic route through the mountains." His expression grew serious. "What about you? Are you staying another night?" I shook my head. "No, I'll leave today too. There's just something I need to do first." After Daniel left, I returned to the journal, searching for any entries that might shed light on my specific situation, dreams of car accidents on mountain roads. I found several, with varying outcomes. In most cases, the accidents occurred despite attempts to avoid them, but the severity and consequences differed significantly based on the dreamer's approach. The most striking entry described a woman who had dreamt of crashing into another vehicle on a foggy mountain pass. Instead of avoiding travel altogether, she had sought out the other driver from her dream, identified by a distinctive bumper sticker, and shared her experience. Together, they had taken the journey on the prophesied day, driving with extreme caution. The accident still occurred when a deer darted into the road, but because they were prepared and traveling slowly, both survived with only minor injuries. This account gave me an idea. According to my dream, I would be standing in the road when Katarina came around the curve in her delivery van. The accident occurred because she was startled by my sudden appearance, swerving to avoid me and losing control of the vehicle. But what if we removed the element of surprise? What if we both knew exactly where and when this would happen, and faced it together. I checked the time, 10:30 in the morning. Katerina had mentioned she usually made her supply run after breakfast. If I hurried, I might catch her before she left. I gathered my belongings, including the charm bracelet, and headed downstairs. The elderly receptionist was at her post, watching me with that same inscrutable expression. "Checking out, Dr. Mitchell?" she asked as I approached. "Yes," I replied, placing my room key on the counter. "I've learned what I needed to learn." She nodded, as if my response confirmed something she already knew. "The hotel has been instructive, then?" "Very," I said, though I'm still not entirely sure why it chose to show me what it did. She smiled, a mysterious curve of thin lips. "The hotel doesn't choose, Dr. Mitchell. It merely reflects. Like water in a still pool, it shows what is already there, within you." Before I could question her further, she handed me my bill. "Katerina left about 15 minutes ago," she added casually. "In case you were wondering." I stared at her, startled by her apparent foreknowledge of my intentions. "Did she take the mountain road?" "She always does," the receptionist confirmed. "It's the only direct route to town." I thanked her hurriedly and rushed out to my rental car, throwing my luggage in the back seat. The charm bracelet I kept in my pocket, my fingers closing around it like a talisman. The mountain road was as treacherous as it had appeared in my dreams, narrow, winding, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock face on the other. I drove as fast as I dared, scanning ahead for any sign of Katerina's delivery van. Around a particularly sharp bend, I spotted it, the white van with the Hotel Autumn logo emblazoned on its side, moving at a cautious pace several curves ahead of me. I increased my speed slightly, hoping to catch up before we reached the spot from my dream. The location was unmistakable when I saw it, a stretch of road where the mountain opened up briefly, offering a panoramic view of the valley below. In my dream, I had been standing in the middle of this stretch, directly in Katerina's path as she rounded the blind curve. I pulled over at a small turnout just before this area and parked. Getting out of my car, I stood at the roadside, waiting for the van to approach. When it appeared around the bend, I raised my hand, signaling for Katerina to stop. She recognized me immediately and pulled over, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Dr. Mitchell," she called through the open window. "What are you doing here?" "I think I've figured it out," I said, approaching the van. "The dream, the accident, it happens here, doesn't it?" She nodded slowly. "Is dangerous spot. Many accidents over years." In my dream, I explained, I'm standing in the road. You come around the curve too fast, swerve to avoid me, and lose control. The van goes over the edge. Katerina's face paled slightly, but she remained composed. "So you come to stop it happening? By being here before I arrive?" "Not exactly," I said. "I think the accident is meant to happen, but not the way it appeared in the dream. We're supposed to face it together with full awareness." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh, not avoid, but transform." "Exactly." I held up the charm bracelet. "In the dream, you were wearing this when the accident occurred. I think it's part of the connection, the link between past events and future possibilities." She hesitated, then took the bracelet and clasped it around her wrist. "What now?" "We continue," I said. "You drive, I'll follow in my car. We face whatever comes, together." Katerina studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "His brave choice." Not many guests choose this way. We returned to our respective vehicles and proceeded along the mountain road, moving at a deliberate pace. The spot where the accident had occurred in my dream approached, and I felt my heart rate accelerate despite my resolve. As we rounded the final curve before the open stretch, I saw it, a fallen tree partially blocking the road, exactly where I had been standing in the dream. Had I actually been there, Katerina would indeed have swerved to avoid me, likely losing control on the loose gravel at the road's edge. Instead, we both stopped safely before the obstacle. Katerina joined me outside our vehicles, staring at the fallen tree. "This is it," she said quietly. "Moment from dream, but changed." Because we chose to face it together, I agreed. With awareness instead of fear. We worked together to move the smaller branches, clearing just enough space for our vehicles to pass. As Katerina reached for a particularly large bough, the charm bracelet caught the sunlight, sending scattered reflections across the road's surface. "Look," she said, pointing to the patterns of light. They coalesced briefly, forming what appeared to be the figure from the fountain, a human shape made of scattered light rather than water, but unmistakably the same entity. "The hotel," I whispered. "It's acknowledging what we've done." The light figures seemed to bow slightly before dissolving back into random sparkles as a cloud passed overhead. When the sun emerged again, the phenomenon did not reappear. After clearing the road sufficiently for passage, we returned to our vehicles. Before parting ways, Katerina approached my window. "You understand now?" she asked. I nodded. "I think so. The hotel shows us possibilities, not to frighten us, but to prepare us. To give us a choice in how we face our fates." "Yes," she confirmed. "And sometimes, when we choose wisely, fate itself changes." She removed the charm bracelet and handed it back to me. "You keep. Maybe help someone else someday." "What about the cycle?" I asked. "The previous psychologist, your sister's guests." "Cycle breaks when someone understands truly," she said. "Not just with mind, but with heart." She tapped her chest for emphasis. "You understand with both. It's different now." We parted ways at the bottom of the mountain, Katerina continuing to town for supplies, and I heading toward the interstate that would take me to the airport. As I drove, I reflected on everything that had transpired at Hotel Autumn. The rational psychologist in me wanted to catalog the experience as a case study in shared delusion or mass suggestion. But a deeper part knew that what had happened transcended conventional explanation, that Hotel Autumn existed in a liminal space between the physical and metaphysical, between future and past, between fact and possibility. The charm bracelet sat on the passenger seat beside me, catching the afternoon sun. I would not be returning it to my ex-wife as originally planned. Instead, I would keep it, as Katerina had suggested, against the day when someone else might need the understanding it had helped me achieve. 3 months later, I published a paper titled Precognitive Rehearsal Therapy, Preparing for Trauma Through Guided Visualization. While I made no mention of Hotel Autumn or prophetic dreams, the principles I outlined were directly informed by my experiences there. The concept that confronting potential traumas in a controlled setting could prepare individuals to face actual crises with greater resilience and presence of mind. The paper was well received, though several colleagues questioned the emphasis I placed on acceptance rather than avoidance as a coping mechanism. Traditional exposure therapy focuses on desensitization, one reviewer noted. Your approach seems to emphasize meaningful engagement with the traumatic scenario. It's an interesting deviation, but what led you to this specific orientation? I couldn't explain that my insights had come from a place where reality itself seemed fluid, where dreams held prophecies and water took human form. Instead, I cited case studies and theoretical frameworks that approximated what I had learned. A year after my stay at Hotel Autumn, I received a package in the mail. It contained Katarina's sister's journal, the complete version, not just the excerpts I had read, along with a brief note. Dr. Mitchell, no accidents on Mountain Road since your visit. Hotel quiet now. Dreams still come, but different, showing possibilities, not warnings. Think your understanding changed something fundamental. Keep journal. Record continues with your story. Maybe someday another psychologist visit Hotel Autumn need to understand what you learned. With gratitude, Katarina. I added the journal to my personal library, between Jung's writings on synchronicity and Frankl's explorations of meaning. Sometimes, late at night, I would read the accounts of those who had stayed at Hotel Autumn before me, their dreams, their choices, their fates, and contemplate the thin membrane that separates what is from what might be. The charm bracelet I kept in my desk drawer, its presence a reminder of connections that transcend conventional understanding between past and future, between stranger and self, between fear and acceptance. And sometimes, in my own dreams, I return to Hotel Autumn. I walk its corridors, sit in its garden, watch as the fountain's waters rise and take human form. But these dreams hold no warnings, no premonitions of tragedy. They are simply reminders of a place where I learned that the future is not fixed but fluid, shaped by our responses to what we perceive as fate. A place where I learned that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but experienced, and that in the experiencing, we discover not just the truth about the mystery, but about ourselves. Have you ever felt a movie watching you back? The flyer appeared on my windshield on a Tuesday afternoon, just a simple piece of paper trapped beneath my wiper blade, fluttering slightly in the dry Arizona breeze. I might have crumpled it up without a second thought if not for the peculiar red ink that seemed to shimmer under the harsh desert sun. The text was simple. One night only. The Majestic Theater. Midnight screening. October 31st. I stared at it longer than necessary. The Majestic had been closed for nearly 20 years. Everyone in Coyote Springs knew that. The abandoned Art Deco building stood at the edge of Main Street like a forgotten monument, its marquee empty, entrance boarded up. As a local journalist always hunting for unusual stories, I'd researched its history when I first moved to town 3 years ago. Hey, Mark, you get one too? I turned to see Elena, the librarian, holding an identical flyer. Her dark eyes reflected the same mixture of curiosity and unease I felt. Yeah, weird, right? The place has been condemned since before either of us moved here. I shook my head, squinting at the shuttered theater visible 2 blocks down. Actually, Elena lowered her voice. There's a local legend about that place. Once a year, on Halloween, people claim the theater mysteriously opens at midnight for a single screening. Nobody knows what film they show. Urban legend, I scoffed, but the prickle at the back of my neck suggested otherwise. The strange part, she continued, is nobody has ever seen the whole film. People who've gone in either leave early or don't remember anything after a certain point. I raised an eyebrow. Sounds like the perfect story for the Coyote Springs Gazette. You're not seriously considering going? Her tone held genuine concern. Hey, I'm a journalist. Strange occurrences are my bread and butter. I folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Besides, it's probably just some local film enthusiasts trying to revive the place for Halloween. That night, I couldn't sleep. The red lettering on the flyer seemed to pulse in my mind like a heartbeat. After tossing and turning until 3 a.m., I got up and did what any self-respecting reporter would do: research. The Majestic's history was unremarkable until 1978, when a projectionist named Victor Crane disappeared during a midnight screening. According to yellow newspaper clippings, the film playing that night was an obscure horror movie that had never been shown before or since. Several audience members reported feeling unwell during the screening. The theater closed temporarily for investigation but reopened months later when no evidence of foul play was found. Then, in 2004, the place shut down permanently after a fire damaged part of the building. But here's where things got interesting. The fire had started in the projection room, and afterward, several people reported seeing lights and hearing sounds from inside the supposedly vacant building, always around midnight, always on Halloween. As the night of October 31st approached, I found myself increasingly drawn to the mystery. I tried pitching the story to my editor, but he dismissed it as tabloid nonsense. Still, I couldn't let it go. Something about that flyer, with its blood-red ink and impossible invitation, tugged at me. The night before Halloween, I drove past the theater. The boards over the entrance looked weathered and untouched. The marquee remained empty, the ticket booth covered in dust. Nothing suggested it would magically spring to life the following night. Yet as I sat in my car, staring at the decrepit facade, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement behind one of the cracked second-story windows, just a shadow shifting slightly, there and gone so quickly I immediately doubted my own eyes. And did I imagine the faint smell of buttered popcorn drifting through my partially open window? As I pulled away, glancing in my rearview mirror, the theater stood silent and dark. But something had changed. The building no longer looked abandoned to me. It looked waiting. Halloween arrived with unusual weather, a heavy, humid air that pressed down on the small town like a lid, trapping the heat of the day well into the evening. By 11:30 p.m., I sat in my car across from the Majestic, camera and notebook ready, watching. The street was deserted, most of Coyote Springs either asleep or at the town's annual Halloween festival in the park. At 11:45, nothing had changed. The theater remained dark, its entrance still boarded up. At 11:55, I noticed a strange vibration in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. At 11:59, the hair on my arm stood up as a low, almost subsonic hum emanated from the building. And at midnight exactly, light spilled from under the doors of the Majestic, and the boards that had covered the entrance were simply gone. The marquee illuminated, displaying 3 words in bold letters: the final viewing. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Down the street, a few curious onlookers had gathered. Some held flyers identical to mine. Their faces showed the same mixture of fascination and apprehension I felt coursing through me. As if pulled by an invisible thread, I stepped out of my car and walked toward the now open doors, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal sensing danger. The lobby glowed with warm, golden light. The air smelled of fresh popcorn and something else, something metallic and strange, like old film stock or developing chemicals. A single ticket booth was staffed by an elderly man whose face seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place him. "One for the midnight showing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The old man smiled. His teeth were too perfect, too white. He didn't speak, but pushed a single red ticket toward me. As I reached for it, our fingers brushed. His skin was ice cold. I entered the main theater, which was larger inside than the building's exterior suggested possible. Red velvet seats stretched into darkness, most already filled with silhouetted figures. The screen loomed ahead, enormous and blank white, like a void waiting to be filled. Finding an empty seat near the aisle, I settled in, notebook ready. The lights dimmed further. The projector whirred to life. And that's when I noticed that none of the other patrons were moving. Not shifting in their seats, not whispering to neighbors, not even appearing to breathe. They sat perfectly still, faces tilted up toward the empty screen, waiting. The countdown began on screen. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and as the film started, I felt a cold draft brush against my neck, like someone breathing softly behind me. When I turned to look, nobody was there. But the exit door, which I'd swear had been closed moments before, was now slightly ajar, a sliver of absolute darkness visible through the gap. The film began without credits or title card, unusual for any movie, but especially for what appeared to be an older production. The grainy black and white footage showed a familiar landscape, the desert outside Coyote Springs, recognizable by the distinctive formation of 3 peaked mesas on the horizon. But something was wrong with the image. The sky seemed too dark, the shadows too deep. And there was a quality to the footage that made my skin crawl, a subtle distortion around the edges, as if the film itself was melting in the projector. As the camera panned across the desert, I jotted notes in my small reporter's notebook. The theater had grown uncomfortably cold. My breath fogged in front of me, yet nobody else seemed affected. They remained motionless, transfixed by the screen. The film cut to a shot of the majestic theater itself, not abandoned as it was now, but alive with light and activity. People streamed in through the doors, dressed in clothing from what looked like the 1970s. The camera lingered on one man in particular, tall, thin, with a nervous expression. He glanced back at the camera as if aware he was being filmed, his eyes wide with fear. With a jolt, I recognized him from my research. Victor Crane, the missing projectionist. I felt suddenly lightheaded. This film couldn't exist. There had been no cameras recording the night Victor disappeared. Yet here he was, climbing the stairs to the projection booth, looking back once more with that same terrified expression. The next shot showed the interior of the theater, this very room, filled with an audience watching a film. And with mounting horror, I realized we were watching them watching a film that showed another audience who were themselves watching a film. A recursive nightmare of audiences within audiences. "This isn't possible," I whispered. A woman 2 seats down from me turned her head, the first movement I'd seen from any audience member. Her face was oddly blurred, as if someone had smudged her features with an eraser. "It's just getting started," she said, her voice distorted like a warp record. "Watch." On screen, the camera now moved through the 1970s audience, pausing on individual faces. Their expressions began to change from enjoyment to confusion, then to discomfort, and finally to terror. One by one, they started to scream, though the film remained silent. And then, slowly, impossibly, the camera began to turn around, as if the person filming was rotating to show what the vintage audience was seeing on their screen. My heart hammered in my chest. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I could now see my breath clouding densely in front of me. My fingers felt numb as I gripped my notebook, the pen slipping from my grasp and rolling under the seat ahead. On screen, we now saw what had terrified the historical audience, another film, showing another theater, this one from perhaps the 1950s, also filled with increasingly distressed viewers. I felt a pressure building in my head, a sense of wrongness that made it difficult to breathe. The recursive imagery created a tunnel effect, like falling through dozens of mirror reflections. Each iteration of the theater looked slightly more wrong, the angle sharper, the shadows deeper, the faces of the audience members more distorted. I forced myself to look away from the screen, needing a moment to regain my composure. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. The audience around me had changed. Where before they had been ordinary people, a mix of curious locals and thrill seekers, they now appeared different. Their outlines seemed to flicker slightly, like bad television reception. Some wore clothing from different eras, a woman in a 1920s flapper dress, a man in a zoot suit, a teenager in 80s punk attire. And they were all looking at me. No, not at me. Past me. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I turned to look behind me again. The exit door stood fully open now. Beyond it wasn't the lobby I'd walked through, but a dark, narrow corridor that couldn't possibly exist within the building's architecture. At the far end of this impossible hallway, something moved in the darkness, a suggestion of height and wrong proportions, of limbs that bent at unnatural angles. I whipped back around, heart threatening to burst from my chest. On screen, the recursive imagery had reached what appeared to be the original film, grainy footage from the earliest days of cinema. The theater shown was ornate, Victorian, filled with well-dressed patrons watching in growing horror as something began to manifest in their midst. The film suddenly cut to black, and in that moment of darkness, I heard breathing, not my own, but something labored and wet, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. When the picture returned, it showed something new. A simple interior room that looked disturbingly like my own apartment. The camera moved slowly through the space, pausing on personal items I recognized, my coffee mug, a framed journalism award, the novel I'd left open on my bedside table just hours ago. What the hell? I muttered, my voice sounding distant and muffled in my own ears. The camera continued its journey through my apartment, finally pushing open the bathroom door to reveal me, standing at the sink, brushing my teeth. But I hadn't filmed this. This was impossible. On screen, my doppelganger paused, toothbrush halfway to his mouth, and slowly turned toward the camera. His eyes widened in recognition, or was it fear? He opened his mouth to speak. And that's when I noticed the date stamp in the corner of the footage, November 1st, 2023. Tomorrow. A rustling sound drew my attention to the seats around me. The other audience members were turning to face me now, their movements jerky and unnatural, like poorly operated marionettes. Their faces had changed, features blurring together, mouths stretching too wide, eyes sunken and dark. "He's showing you," whispered the woman who had spoken earlier, her voice now barely human. "He's always been showing us." "Who?" I managed to ask, my throat constricted with fear. She smiled, her teeth too numerous, too sharp. "The projectionist, of course." On screen, my apartment suddenly filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. My doppelganger backed away, terror evident in his face as the darkness gathered into a vaguely humanoid shape. I tried to stand, to leave, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the seat itself held me in place. The film abruptly cut to a new angle, a camera looking up from the floor of my apartment as the shadow figure loomed over my fallen doppelganger. Then another cut to what appeared to be a shaky handheld shot moving through the back corridors of a theater, this theater, the walls covered in curling, yellowed movie posters. The camera approached a door marked projection room and slowly pushed it open. Inside was not projection equipment, but a vast space that defied the building's dimensions, a cavernous room filled with thousands of film canisters stacked to impossible heights. At the center stood an editing table where a figure hunched over strips of film. The figure turned slowly toward the camera. It was Victor Crane, but wrong. His features seemed to shift and change as if multiple faces were trying to emerge from one. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's. When he smiled, his mouth opened too wide, revealing row upon row of teeth like film sprockets. "Welcome to tonight's feature," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "You're just in time for your scene." The real horror wasn't what I was seeing, it was the dawning realization of what was happening. This wasn't just a film. It was something using the film, the theater, as a doorway. Each recursive layer had been another threshold, another weakening of whatever separated this world from whatever lay beyond. I tore my gaze from the screen with tremendous effort, looking desperately around the theater for an escape route. The exit door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. The other audience members now barely looked human, their forms stretched and twisted, clothes melding with skin, faces reduced to suggestions rather than distinct features. Only the screen provided light now, its glow taking on a sickening pulsating quality. The shadows it cast seemed to move independently, reaching out into the audience like probing fingers. On screen, Victor Crane, or the thing wearing his appearance, was now sorting through film strips, holding them up to the light. Each strip showed scenes from people's lives, ordinary moments made terrible by their invasion of privacy, by the impossibility of how they were obtained. "Everyone has a role to play," Not Victor said, his voice now coming from the theater speakers and seemingly from inside my own head simultaneously. "Some are just extras, background for the main event. But you, Mark," he held up a strip of film that clearly showed me entering the theater earlier that night, "you get to be a featured player." I tried again to stand, to scream, to do anything, but my body refused to cooperate. It was as if I, too, was becoming just another image projected on a screen, flat and powerless. The thing that wasn't Victor leaned toward the camera, his face filling the screen. "Film is just light and shadow, you know. Reality isn't so different. Just a matter of what's illuminated and what's left in darkness." His face began to change, features melting away to reveal something else beneath, something composed of crawling shadows and negative space. "Would you like to see what's in the darkness, Mark?" The film abruptly cut to black again. In the sudden darkness, I felt something cold brush against my cheek, like fingers, but too long, too thin. When the screen illuminated again, it showed a single, horrifying image, my face, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, not as I was now, but as the film predicted I would be tomorrow. Behind me in the image, reflected in a mirror, stood a figure composed entirely of darkness, its hand resting on my shoulder, its featureless face bent next to mine as if whispering in my ear. And I knew with absolute certainty that it was here in the theater with me now, moving closer with each flickering frame of film. A sharp pain in my palm jolted me back to myself. I'd been clenching my fists so tightly that my nails had broken skin. The small crescents welled with blood, and that trivial, human pain became my anchor to reality. I focused on it, used it to pull myself back from the edge of paralyzing terror. "Think, Mark. Think." The film continued its nightmarish progression. On screen, the thing wearing Victor Crane's face was now splicing together different strips of film, scenes from my life intercut with footage of other audience members. With each splice, the boundary between film and reality seemed to thin. The temperature in the theater dropped further, frost now crystallized on the armrests of my seat. I needed to move, to escape, but my body still wouldn't fully respond. I managed only to twitch my fingers, to turn my head slightly. It was as if I were becoming part of the film itself, my movements restricted to what the frame allowed. The sound from the speakers changed, becoming a low, rhythmic pulsing that matched the beat of my heart. With each pulse, the theater seemed to expand and contract like a breathing thing. The walls stretched outward before snapping back, the ceiling rose and fell. The architecture itself was coming alive, or perhaps revealing its true nature. I focused all my will on my right hand, forcing it to move centimeter by centimeter toward my jacket pocket, where my phone sat. If I could just call someone, document what was happening. "He won't let you," whispered the woman beside me, her voice now sounding as if it came from underwater. "No signals get out during the screening. No evidence remains afterward." I turned to look at her and immediately wished I hadn't. Her face had become a projection surface, flickering with rapid images from other films, other times, other places. Through this chaotic display, her eyes remained fixed on mine, no longer human eyes, but dark voids that seemed to recede forever. "How do you know?" I managed to rasp, my voice barely audible. Her mouth stretched into a terrible smile. "Because I tried the year before. And the year before that. We all did." With mounting horror, I realized the implication. "You're from previous screenings?" She nodded, the motion jerky and unnatural. "We become part of it. Part of the audience. Part of the film. Time works differently here. The screening never really ends for some of us." On screen, Victor, or whatever was using his form, looked up suddenly, as if hearing our conversation. He smiled directly at the camera. "Spoilers," he said, the word distorted and stretched. "Bad etiquette, don't you think? Let Mark experience the feature for himself." The woman beside me made a small, frightened sound and seemed to fold in on herself, her form collapsing like paper being crumpled by invisible hands. Within seconds, she was gone, leaving behind an empty seat that slowly melted into the surrounding darkness. I fought against the paralysis with renewed desperation, managing to move my arm a few more inches. The effort left me exhausted, my breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded thickly in the freezing air. The damp chill had penetrated to my bones, making each movement an agony of stiffened muscles and joints. On screen, the narrative had shifted again. Now it showed the exterior of the Majestic as it appeared in daylight, abandoned, decrepit, boarded up. The camera zoomed in on one of the second-story windows, the same one where I thought I'd seen movement the night before. Behind the dirty glass, a face watched, my face, gaunt and terrified, mouth open in a silent scream. My doppelganger pounded on the window, leaving bloody smears on the glass. "This isn't real," I told myself. "It's just a film. Images projected on a screen." But even as I thought this, I felt something fundamental shifting in my understanding. What if film wasn't just a recording of reality? What if it could be something more, a trap for experience, a cage for consciousness? What if each frame could hold not just an image but a soul? The sound design changed again, becoming a cacophony of whispers, hundreds of overlapping voices too quiet to distinguish individually but collectively creating a sensation of drowning in murmured secrets. Among them, occasionally, I caught fragments that seemed directed at me. "Should have left when. Tried to warn you. Your turn now." I finally reached my pocket and closed my fingers around my phone. The simple plastic and glass felt bizarre against my skin, an artifact from a normal world that seemed increasingly distant. With tremendous effort, I pulled it out and pressed the power button. The screen remained dark. I pressed harder, desperately, but it was as if the device had been drained of all power, or as if the laws of reality that allowed it to function had been suspended in this place. On the cinema screen, Victor Crane's distorted face filled the frame again. He held up a strip of film to the light, and I could clearly see it showed me sitting in this very theater, phone in hand, face contorted with fear. "You can't call for help, Mark," he said, his voice now coming from directly behind me rather than from the speakers. "No one interrupts the screening. It's considered very rude." I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to see if he was actually there, standing behind my seat. Instead, I focused on the exits again. The main doors remained gone, replaced by a seamless wall. But maybe the emergency exit. I twisted in my seat, scanning the sidewalls. There, a faint red glow of an exit sign, barely visible through the thickening darkness that gathered at the theater's edges. It looked miles away, though logically it could only be 20 or 30 feet. On screen, fresh horror unfolded. The camera now showed what appeared to be an endless library of film canisters, each labeled with a name and date. The thing wearing Victor's form walked along the shelves, running his two long fingers over the canisters lovingly. "Everyone who's ever attended a screening," he said, "preserved perfectly. Well, not their bodies. Those eventually get found, usually in their homes, sometimes in their cars, occasionally in empty fields. Dead of apparent heart failure, their faces frozen in expressions of ultimate terror." He pulled out a canister labeled Elena Reyes, October 31st, 2022. My blood went cold. Elena, the librarian who warned me about the theater. I hadn't seen her in months. Had assumed she'd moved away without saying goodbye, as people sometimes did in small towns. She was curious too, Not Victor said, opening the canister and pulling out a length of film. "Journalists, researchers, thrill seekers, you're all the same. You think you're the protagonist, the one who will uncover the mystery, survive the horror, tell the tale." He held the film strip up, and I could see Elena's face captured in the frames, her expression changing from curiosity to dawning horror to absolute terror. "But you're not protagonists," he continued. "You're not even supporting characters. You're just new content. Fresh footage. More frames for the eternal screening." With that, he fed Elena's film into what looked like an ancient editing device. The machine whirred to life, its mechanisms moving with organic, pulsating motions that no real machine could make. I tore my eyes away from the screen, focusing instead on the exit sign. It was my only hope. If I could just reach it. With monumental effort, I pushed against the paralysis that held me, against the very fabric of this warped reality. Something gave way, not completely, but enough that I could shift my weight forward, preparing to stand. The theater itself seemed to notice. The walls contracted sharply, the shadows at the edges of my vision thickened and began to move with purpose, flowing like liquid darkness toward me. The other audience members, those twisted, barely human shapes, turned as one to stare. On screen, Victor's distorted face split into a terrible grin. "It seems we have a patron attempting to leave before the feature's conclusion. How disappointing." I lunged to my feet, nearly falling as my stiff legs threatened to buckle beneath me. The cold was so intense now that each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. My movements were sluggish, dreamlike, as if I were trying to run underwater. The theater responded immediately. The rows of seats began to undulate, rising and falling like ocean waves, creating an impossible landscape between me and the exit. The darkness gathered itself into vague, reaching forms that groped blindly toward me. Behind me, I heard movement, something large shifting in the space where the projection booth would be. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Every instinct screamed that to see what was truly projecting this nightmare would be to lose myself entirely. I staggered forward, navigating the now fluid geography of the theater. The seats around me transformed as I passed, metal and fabric twisting into organic forms that reached for my ankles with spindly, finger-like protrusions. From the screen, dozens of faces watched my progress, faces I recognized from around Coyote Springs, people who had disappeared over the years. Their expressions were uniformly blank, eyes hollow, as if whatever had made them individuals had been stripped away, leaving only empty shells. Among them, I spotted Elena, her once lively features now slack and vacant. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the cacophony of whispers that filled the theater. I was halfway to the exit now, moving in a stumbling run. The air had become thick, resistant, each step requiring tremendous effort. Behind me, the sounds changed, the whispers giving way to a wet, slithering noise, like something massive dragging itself across the floor. On screen, Victor's form began to disintegrate, the human disguise melting away to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath, a shifting collage of film and shadow, of recorded moments and stolen faces, all wrapped around something ancient and hungry that had found in cinema the perfect medium to bridge worlds. The show isn't over, Mark, his voice boomed, no longer coming from any specific direction but seeming to emanate from the theater itself. No one leaves until the credits roll. The exit sign flickered and dimmed, the door beneath it beginning to shrink, to recede into the wall. I pushed myself harder, legs burning with effort, lungs straining in the frigid air. 3 more rows to go. 2. 1. I reached the exit just as it had shrunk to half its original size. Without hesitation, I threw myself at the narrowing opening, squeezing through the gap with desperate strength. My jacket caught on something, not the door frame, but what felt like dozens of tiny, grasping hands. I tore free, leaving a scrap of fabric behind. I expected to emerge into the alley behind the theater. Instead, I found myself in a narrow, twisting corridor that couldn't possibly fit within the building's architecture. The walls were covered in old movie posters, their images animated and moving, scenes playing out in endless loops. The floor beneath my feet wasn't solid but seemed composed of countless strips of film layered over one another, each one showing fragments of someone's last moments in the theater. Behind me, the exit door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the impossible space. From beyond it came a sound of rage, a roar that contained hundreds of voices screaming in unison. I ran blindly down the corridor, which twisted and turned at impossible angles. The animated posters watched me pass, their characters stepping forward as if trying to emerge from their paper prisons. Hands reached from the walls, fingers formed from celluloid and shadow, grasping at my clothes, my hair, my skin. The corridor seemed endless, doubling back on itself, branching into multiple paths that all somehow led back to the same stretch of nightmare hallway. I was trapped in a spatial loop, a 3-dimensional film strip playing the same sequence over and over. My strength was failing, the cold and terror sapping my endurance. After what felt like hours of frantic running, I collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath. The poster beside me depicted the Majestic in its heyday, crowds of smiling patrons entering its doors. As I watched, their expressions changed to terror, their bodies contorting as something unseen fell upon them. "You can't escape the screening," said a voice beside me. I turned to find Elena standing there, not the hollow-eyed version from the screen, but as I remembered her, though slightly translucent, her edges blurring like an image slightly out of focus. "Elena?" I gasped. "What's left of me," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "I tried to warn you, Mark. I really did. What is this place? What's happening?" She gestured at the film strips that composed the floor. It found a way through. something from elsewhere. It discovered it could use film as a bridge, capturing pieces of souls in each frame, feeding on fear, on attention, on belief. She looked down sadly. The more people who attend a screening, the stronger it becomes. How do I get out? I pleaded. I don't know if you can. Not completely. Her form flickered like a projection losing power. But if you want to survive, you need to reach the projection booth. It's the heart of this place. The source. And do what? Change the ending, she whispered, already fading. Every film has an ending. Even this one. Before I could ask more, she vanished entirely, leaving me alone in the twisted corridor. But her words had given me purpose. The projection booth. I needed to find my way there. I pushed myself back to my feet, ignoring the pain in my freezing limbs, and continued down the corridor. This time, I focused not on escape but on finding a way up to where the projection booth would be in a normal theater. The corridor resisted my efforts, twisting away whenever I seemed to be making progress, leading me in circles. But I began to notice patterns in the chaos, how certain posters appeared at junction points, how the film strips on the floor aligned in specific directions like subtle arrows. I was in a maze designed by a filmmaker's nightmare logic. And like any maze, it had to have a center. After countless wrong turns and looping paths, I finally found a narrow staircase spiraling upward, its steps made of stacked film reels that shifted slightly under my weight. I climbed cautiously, aware that at any moment the structure might collapse beneath me or transform into something worse. At the top of the stairs stood a simple door marked projection. From beyond it came the mechanical whirring of an ancient projector and, beneath that, a sound like wet, labored breathing. I placed my hand on the doorknob, which was ice cold against my skin. This was it, the heart of the nightmare, the source of the horror that had claimed so many before me. Whatever waited beyond was ancient and powerful, a predator that had found in cinema the perfect hunting ground. But I had come too far to turn back now. With Elena's words echoing in my mind, "Change the ending," I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The door swung open onto a space that defied comprehension. What should have been a small, utilitarian room was instead a vast, cathedral-like chamber whose dimensions fluctuated with each passing second, expanding outward into impossible darkness before contracting to nearly crush me, then expanding again in a rhythm like labored breathing. At the center stood not a projector, but a towering, pulsating column of light and shadow, film strips feeding into and emerging from it in endless loops. The strips twisted through the air like living things, images flickering across their surfaces, thousands of faces frozen in terror, moments of ultimate fear captured and preserved forever. And attending this monstrous mechanism was a figure that only vaguely resembled Victor Crane now. His human form had mostly melted away, revealing what lay beneath, a writhing mass of film and shadow, of negative space given substance. Where his face should have been was a void that seemed to recede infinitely, like looking into two mirrors facing each other. Yet somehow, I knew it was watching me. "The journalist arrives at last," it said, its voice a chorus of all the voices I'd heard whispering in the theater. "Come to write the final scene?" I stood paralyzed in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The cold was so intense here that frost formed on my eyelashes, tiny ice crystals blurring my vision. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding fragile and small in the vast space. The thing made a motion that might have been a shrug. "I am the projectionist. The director. The editor." Film strips twisted around what might have been arms, forming constantly shifting appendages. I am what watches from the darkness while you watch the screen. It gestured toward the column of light and shadow. For centuries, I was trapped on the other side, able only to peek through. Photography gave me windows. Cinema gave me doors. As it spoke, the chamber pulsed, images playing across its walls, the history of film, from early experiments with moving pictures to modern digital cinema. But twisted, wrong, showing not the technology's development but its gradual corruption by something alien. Fear is my medium, the thing continued, circling me with movements that seemed to leave after images in the air. Terror captures the essence of consciousness more perfectly than any other emotion. In those moments of pure, primal fear, humans are most concentrated, most vital. It gestured at the countless strips of film feeding into the central column. Each frame, a perfect preservation of that essence. Each screening, a new harvest. I struggled to keep my thoughts coherent as the temperature continued to drop. My extremities had gone numb, and each breath felt like inhaling liquid nitrogen. But somewhere beneath the terror, a spark of journalistic curiosity still burned. The yearly screenings I managed through chattering teeth. Why Halloween? Why this theater? The thing made a sound like film tearing. It took me a moment to realize it was laughing. Thresholds, little journalist. Liminal spaces. The veil thins at certain times, in certain places. Its voice shifted, becoming almost professorial. October 31st. Midnight. A theater, already a place designed for transition between reality and fantasy. The Majestic stands at a convergence of, let's call them ley lines. Channels of energy that make passage easier. It reached out with a limb composed of writhing film strips, almost touching my face. I jerked back instinctively. I've been cultivating this space for decades. Laying groundwork. Building audience. The more who attend, the stronger the connection becomes. Soon, I won't need the yearly constraint. Soon, the screening will be continuous. The implication hit me like a physical blow. This thing wasn't just harvesting individuals, it was working towards something larger. Something worse. And what happens then? I asked, playing for time as I desperately tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. The entity's void face seemed to expand, the darkness deepening. Then the real feature begins. Reality itself becomes the screen, and what magnificent terrors we shall project upon it. As it spoke, the walls of the chamber displayed apocalyptic visions. Cities were buildings twisted into organic forms, streets filled with shuffling figures whose faces constantly shifted between terror and blankness, skies torn open to reveal something vast and incomprehensible beyond. I found myself backing away, my shoulder blades pressing against the door frame. But the door that had admitted me was gone, replaced by a wall of writhing darkness. No escape, the thing said simply. The final reel is loading. Your contribution is required. It gestured, and a section of the floor near my feet transformed, rising up to form what looked like an antique director's chair. Straps made of film strips writhed at its arms and legs like eager serpents. Please, take a seat, the entity said, its voice now a perfect imitation of a courteous usher. The feature presentation is about to begin. I knew with absolute certainty that if I sat in that chair, I would join the faces trapped in the endless film strips, my fear feeding this thing forever. I had to find a way to change the ending, as Elena had said. But how? My gaze darted around the chamber, searching for anything I could use. The central column of light and shadow seemed to be the heart of whatever mechanism powered this nightmare. If I could disrupt it somehow. Your thoughts are transparent, journalist, the entity said, amusement in its multi-layered voice. Many have tried before you. Observe. It gestured, and part of the wall transformed into a screen showing previous victims' final moments, their desperate attempts to escape or fight back, all ending in failure as they were absorbed into the entity's collection. Among them, I saw Elena rushing the central column only to be enveloped by twisting film strips that seemed to peel her very essence away, leaving behind an empty shell that collapsed lifelessly to the floor. You see? Resistance is merely another scene in the script. Another reaction shot to capture. It was right. Physical resistance seemed futile. This place operated by dream logic, by the rules of cinema rather than reality. And in a horror film, the monster always. A thought struck me, so simple yet so profound that for a moment it cut through my terror, bringing clarity. In a horror film, the monster always wins, except when it doesn't. When the protagonist finds the one weakness, the one rule that can be broken. Every film has rules. Conventions. Expectations. I found myself laughing, a strained, hysterical sound that nevertheless seemed to give the entity pause. Something amuses you at the threshold of eternity? It asked, the void of its face contracting slightly. Just appreciating the irony, I said, forcing confidence into my voice. A film entity that doesn't understand the basics of storytelling. The chamber pulsed, the walls contracting sharply before expanding again. I had touched a nerve. Explain, it demanded, looming closer. I met the void where its eyes should be, ignoring the vertigo that threatened to overwhelm me as I stared into that infinite regression. Every good horror needs catharsis, I said. Without it, you don't have art, you just have torture. Audiences need resolution, need hope, even if it's just a sliver. Otherwise, the fear isn't entertaining, it's just meaningless suffering. The entity made the tearing film sound again, but this time it didn't sound like laughter. You presume to lecture me on fear? On storytelling? I who have witnessed the birth of cinema itself. Yes, I said, surprising myself with my steadiness. Because you've forgotten the most basic rule, the audience needs to believe there's a way out. Otherwise, they disconnect. They stop investing emotionally. They walk out. As I spoke, I noticed something changing in the chamber. The pulsing had become irregular, the walls fluctuating erratically. Film strips whipped through the air agitatedly. The screening never ends, the entity insisted, but there was a note of uncertainty in its chorus of voices now. The fear sustains me. But what happens when your audience stops being afraid? I pressed, recognizing that I had found a vulnerability. What happens when they reject the premise? I thought of every horror film I'd ever seen, every trope and convention. The final girl. The moment of realization. The turning of the tables. This is your story, I said, my voice growing stronger. Your narrative. But you've trapped yourself in a loop, playing the same scene over and over. The monster terrifies. The victim screams. Roll credits. It's predictable. It's boring. The chamber shuddered violently at that last word. The central column flickered, the light within it dimming momentarily before surging back to life. You know nothing, the entity hissed, its form becoming less stable, film strips slashing the air like angry tentacles. Fear is eternal. Fear is subjective, I interrupted. Changeable. What terrifies one generation amuses the next. Old monsters become jokes, cliches. When was the last time you actually innovated? When was the last time you created true horror instead of recycling the same cheap scares? Each word seemed to land like a physical blow. The entity's form fluctuated wildly, the void at its center expanding and contracting. I pressed my advantage, moving away from the wall, standing taller. You're not the director here. You're not even the star. You're just a tired old trope that doesn't realize the audience has moved on. The chamber was now in chaos, the walls melting and reforming, the film strips writhing as if in pain. The central column flickered erratically, images flashing across its surface too quickly to comprehend. The entity lunged at me, its form elongating impossibly. But its movements were jerky, uncertain, like a film being played at the wrong speed. You cannot deny me, it rasped. I am the ultimate fear. The darkness beyond the screen. I stood my ground, though every instinct screamed at me to run. No. You're just another monster waiting to be defeated in the final act. And this, I gestured at the crumbling chamber around us, this is the final act. The entity shrieked, a sound like thousands of feet of film tearing simultaneously. It reared back, its form twisting on itself as if caught in some unseen projector. I reject your ending, I shouted over the cacophony. I reject your narrative. This story doesn't end with my capture, it ends with your defeat. The central column began to collapse, light pouring from cracks in its surface. The film strips feeding into it caught fire, flames racing along their length in both directions. The entity thrashed wildly, its form disintegrating. You cannot. The screening must continue. Credits roll, I said firmly. House lights up. Audience leaves. With those words, the chamber seemed to implode, the walls rushing inward before exploding outward in a silent concussion of light and shadow. I was thrown backward, tumbling through darkness, falling through layer after layer of film and fantasy and fear. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was the entity reaching toward me, its form now barely coherent, more absence than presence, its void face contracting to a single point of absolute darkness that winked out like a star dying. And then nothing. I woke to the sound of someone calling my name. Mark? Mark? Can you hear me? Sunlight stabbed painfully through my eyelids as I tried to open them. My entire body felt frozen and thawed, joints creaking in protest as I attempted to move. He's coming around, said a vaguely familiar voice. With tremendous effort, I managed to focus on the face hovering above me, Officer Rodriguez, Coyote Springs Chief of Police. Behind him stood several paramedics and curious onlookers, their forms silhouetted against the morning sky. What happened? My voice emerged as a dry rasp. That's what we'd like to know, Rodriguez said, his withered face creased with concern. A jogger found you unconscious on the sidewalk in front of the Majestic. You've been out here all night from the looks of it. I struggled to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in every muscle. We were indeed outside the old theater, which stood derelict and boarded up in the harsh morning light. No sign remained of the open doors, the illuminated marquee, the crowds of patrons I'd seen enter. What time is it? I asked, trying to gather my thoughts. Just after 7 a.m., November 1st, Rodriguez answered, watching me carefully. Halloween festivities get a little out of hand, did they? November 1st. The date stamp I'd seen on the screen. I shivered despite the warmth of the morning sun. I was inside, I said, pointing at the theater. There was a screening at midnight. The place was open. People were going in. Rodriguez exchanged a look with one of the paramedics. Mark, that's not possible. The Majestic has been condemned for years. Nobody's been inside legally since the fire. Check it, I insisted. There's something in there. Something using the theater, using film to feed, to cross over. My words sounded delusional even to my own ears. Rodriguez sighed, placing a hand on my shoulder. Let's get you checked out at the clinic first. You might have a concussion or... No. I jerked away from his touch, scrambling to my feet despite the protest of my aching body. You have to check it now, before the trail goes cold. Perhaps it was the wild look in my eyes, or something in my voice that conveyed absolute conviction. Whatever the reason, Rodriguez studied me for a long moment before nodding. All right. Johnson, he called to a deputy, bring the bolt cutters from the cruiser. We'll take a quick look. 20 minutes later, after cutting through the chains that secured the plywood over the main entrance, we stood in the lobby of the Majestic. In daylight, filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, the place looked exactly as an abandoned theater should, dusty, decrepit, forgotten. The concession stand was empty, its glass cases shattered. Faded posters hung in tatters from the walls. Satisfied? Rodriguez asked, gesturing around the empty space. Nobody's been in here for years. I shook my head, moving deeper into the building. The main theater. We need to check the main theater. Rodriguez sighed but followed as I pushed through the double doors that led to the screening room. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that penetrated the gloom. Rows of seats, many broken or missing entirely, stretched toward a blank screen hanging in tatters. No sign of the horrors I'd witnessed. No evidence of the entity or its victims. The projection booth, I said, already heading for the stairs at the side of the theater. That's where it all happens. Rodriguez followed, his hand now resting warily on his holstered gun. We climbed the narrow staircase, cobwebs catching in our hair, the steps creaking dangerously beneath our weight. The door to the projection booth stood partially open, hanging from a single rusty hinge. I pushed it wider, stepping into a small, mundane room. An ancient projector sat covered in dust, film reels scattered across the floor as if abandoned in haste. Nothing supernatural. No vast, breathing chamber. No writhing film strips or pulsating column of light and darkness. Mark, Rodriguez said gently, there's nothing here. Let's get you to the clinic. I moved to the projector, running my fingers over its dusty surface. Had it all been a hallucination? A vivid nightmare brought on by an overactive imagination and local legends? Then my fingers found something, a strip of film still threaded through the projector's mechanisms. With trembling hands, I carefully extracted it, holding it up to a shaft of sunlight. 3 frames. Just 3 frames of film, showing a face contorted in terror. Elena's face. Do you recognize her? I asked Rodriguez, pointing to the image. He squinted, then nodded slowly. The librarian. Elena something. Moved away last year, didn't she? Did she? I pressed. Or did she disappear? Did anyone actually see her leave town, help her pack, get a forwarding address? Rodriguez frowned, thinking. I don't recall. But people come and go in small towns all the time. Check your missing persons reports for the past 20 years, I said. Specifically around Halloween. I bet you'll find a pattern. Something in my voice must have reached him because he gave me a long, measuring look before nodding. "I'll look into it." He gestured to the film strip in my hand. "You want to keep that as evidence?" I stared at the 3 frames, at Elena's frozen terror. Then, with a decisive motion, I tore the strip in half, then quarters, then crumpled the pieces in my fist. "No," I said. "Some things shouldn't be preserved." Rodriguez didn't question me further as we left the theater, sealing it up once more with fresh boards and chains. He insisted I visit the clinic anyway, where doctors found nothing physically wrong with me beyond mild hypothermia and exhaustion. As I left the clinic, stepping into the bright November morning, I felt strangely hollow. Had I truly experienced those horrors, or merely dreamed them? The film strip had been real enough, but it could have been an old publicity still, a frame from some forgotten horror movie starring an actress who resembled Elena. I walked to my apartment building in a daze, fumbling with my keys at the door. Inside, everything looked normal, exactly as I'd left it the night before. My coffee mug on the counter, my journalism award on the shelf, my novel open on the bedside table. Just like the footage had shown. I checked my bathroom cautiously, half expecting to see myself standing at the sink, but it was empty. Relief washed over me as I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the lingering sense of unreality. In the mirror, my reflection looked haggard, dark circles under my eyes, skin pale from my night in the cold. But it was me, just me. No shadow figure looming behind me, no void-faced entity whispering in my ear. I released a shuddering breath, feeling the tension begin to drain from my body. Perhaps it had been a nightmare after all, a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and local ghost stories. Perhaps. The lights flickered once, twice. From my living room, I heard a sound, the subtle whirring of machinery starting up. With leaden dread weighing down my steps, I moved toward the sound. My television had turned itself on, showing only static. As I watched, paralyzed, the static resolved itself into an image, the interior of the Majestic, the seats filled with silhouetted figures all facing forward, watching. Slowly, as if sensing my presence, they began to turn, row by row, to face the camera. To face me. Their features were blurred, indistinct, but their eyes were clear, hollow, and hungry. From the speakers came a voice I recognized, a chorus of whispers coalescing into words. "The screening never ends, Mark. Only the venue changes." The screen went black. In its darkness, I saw my own reflection, and behind me, barely visible at the edge of perception, something moved. I whirled around, but my apartment was empty. Just furniture and morning light and the lingering chill of a night spent in the cold. On my coffee table lay a flyer that hadn't been there before, red text on black paper, shimmering slightly in the sunlight. "Now showing, your feature presentation. Screening continuous." As I stared at it, the text seemed to shift and change, the letters rearranging themselves to form new words. "See you next Halloween." I crumpled the flyer in my fist, then rushed to my fireplace, striking a match with trembling fingers. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening, the red ink seeming to bubble and flow like blood before the flames consumed it entirely. When nothing remained but ashes, I sat back on my heels, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. What had happened at the Majestic? Had I truly confronted some ancient entity that used film as a medium to cross between worlds? Had I defeated it, or merely escaped temporarily? Or was I still there, trapped in that theater seat, my consciousness captured on endless celluloid while my body waited to be found, Another mysterious case of apparent heart failure with an expression of ultimate terror frozen on my face? I don't know. Even now, months later, I don't know. What I do know is this: I've gotten rid of my television. My laptop remains in a drawer, powered down. My phone is used only for calls, never for videos or photos. I've avoided cameras of all kinds, declined to be photographed, stayed away from movie theaters. I've written this account as a warning, but I don't know if sharing it helps or hurts, if spreading the story weakens the entity or strengthens it by expanding its audience. Sometimes, in the moments before sleep, I hear the whirring of a projector, the subtle rattling of film through sprockets. Sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of shadows moving independently of any light source. And sometimes, I wonder if the entity was right, if fear truly is the most concentrated form of consciousness, the purest distillation of what it means to be alive. If terror is the emotion that most firmly anchors us to reality or most completely separates us from it. I've put in for a transfer at the newspaper. I'm leaving Coyote Springs next week for a larger city, a place with more people, more noise, more light. A place where an abandoned theater can't stand like a sentinel at the edge of town, its marquee empty but somehow expected. But before I go, I drive past the Majestic one more time in broad daylight, forcing myself to look at its decrepit facade, its boarded windows, its faded grandeur. And as I watch, a flutter of movement catches my eye, just a piece of paper, a flyer perhaps, caught in the wind and pressed against one of the second-story windows. For a moment, it looks almost like a face peering out at me. For a moment, it almost looks like my face. But then the wind changes, and the paper is gone, and the Majestic stands silent and empty under the Arizona sun, waiting for next Halloween, for midnight, for the next screening to begin. Because some stories don't end when the credits roll. Some stories are always playing somewhere, on some screen, in some darkened theater where the audience sits perfectly still, faces upturned toward the flickering light, watching horrors unfold with the absolute certainty that none of it is real, that it's all just images projected on a screen. Just light and shadow. Just light and shadow. Just. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.